So today we are going to be talking about content access on Drupal sites. This was something that came up last month as a question when we were talking about building a site. There were both Ellen and Jack had examples where they needed to restrict viewing or editing access in some combination. And I wasn't prepared to answer that question because it turned out to be a pretty complicated question. Because this is one of those areas where there's so many ways to accomplish the goal. So I did some research in the meantime so that I'd be a little bit more prepared. And I'm going to go over plan today is to go over the modules and techniques that are out there for restricting access to content and kind of talk about what the best options are, why you would pick one over another. Probably we won't get into anything about custom development of those modules, but depending on how time goes, I might just kind of give a brief overview of that. So to start off with, just to define some terms, we're talking today about restricting access to content, and content can mean lots of different parts of a site. Can be, of course, nodes on a Drupal site, but also files, blocks, menu items, taxonomy terms. There's lots of things that could be considered content. For the simplicity of discussion today, I'm going to focus on nodes because they're the most common case. Most of these solutions apply to others as well. But nodes are a little special because there is a dedicated access control system for nodes. So you can do some things there a little bit more easily than with some other content types sometimes, or entity types sometimes. Also, when we say access control, we could be talking about viewing content, or we could be talking about editing content. And there are a lot of different scenarios that will make one or the other more important. And so we're gonna cover that as well. Most of the access control solutions are more focused on viewing content because that's kind of the most typical situation where you have a few administrators in charge of a site. They're trusted, but maybe some of the content is private to a particular class of user. But there are certainly a lot of other scenarios like we talked about last month. So try to get into some of those as well. So first out of the gate, let's talk about the things you can do with a Drupal installation without installing any contributed modules at all. There's a lot actually you can do in Drupal 8. You can control access to a node by changing who the author is of the node, by changing whether a node is published or not, and changing the permissions associated with roles on the site. So really the default actually is to not let people see content, which is a little counterintuitive because most people on a stock install are going to have everything visible by everyone, but that's not actually what's happening at the core. Normally, you're going to get an access denied message if you try to view some content. The reason you don't is usually that the node is published and the user has the permission that's called view published content. So it's kind of the typical starting setup is that you give anonymous and authenticated users both that permission, which means everyone can see anything that is marked as published. But all you have to do To revoke that is turn off that permission. Users can also view nodes if they have the bypass content access control permission, which is one of those that on the permissions page has a big warning sign next to it because it's dangerous to give that to someone you don't fully trust. It means they can do everything, see and do everything on the site, basically. And then the third built-in thing is that there's a permission called view own unpublished content, which lets you see unpublished things if you are the author. So that's what you can do with the built-in view permissions. There are also corresponding editing permissions. So you can edit a node if, again, you have that bypass access content access control permission, the one that is in charge of everything. You can also edit content if you have the edit any content permission, and there's one of those per content type. Notice that's not the case for viewing. Viewing, it's everything or nothing. I can get a little bit into the reasons for that later, but editing is broken down per content type. Similarly, there's edit own content for each content type, and you have to be the node's author to be able to edit it in that case. So some scenarios where that would be enough. If you have content on your site that is, if the whole site is private, all you have to do is turn off the view published content permission for anonymous users, and then you have to have a login to be able to see any content. If you have a site that's completely public, but you have more than one editor and you want them to be able to edit everything, you give that editor role the edit any content permission, and you can do that per content type. So that's all built in. So if you need more than that, you can start looking at installing contributed modules for this. And there are a ton of these modules. We can, if we do a quick search on Drupal.org, let me share. Okay, and we go to modules, and we say, let's just look at Drupal 8 compatible modules that have something to do with content access control. There are 245 modules matching that search. Now, that category is a little broader than the sense of content access control that we're talking about today, because you can see that CAPTCHA is the very first thing, which is sort of has to do with content access control, but not specifically. Field permissions, which we're not really going to get into today, but lets you restrict access to editing specific fields on a piece of content. That's a useful one. Letting specific user roles view unpublished nodes. There are just a lot of specific options. Password protecting things that aren't protected by who's logged in, but just by entering a password. There are all sorts of special cases. So we're going to focus on some of the best ones that have to do with controlling access based on who is logged in. Okay, so first off, I built a little basic Drupal site with 2 content types on it, made a little content, assigned it to different authors, and have some published and some not. So the first thing, before we even get into the modules that might be on or off, I want to call out something unusual in this view. You'll see that one of the items in this view is not published. So if we go to that item, we get access denied. Whereas if we go to one of the other ones, we get the content. So published is working, sort of, but we can still see it in this list. So I thought this was worth calling out because this is a little counterintuitive. Whether something is published or not doesn't automatically hide it from listings. In the view itself, you need to actually have a filter where you say, I only want to see content that is published. Otherwise, the view will show things that people don't actually have access to. And that is by default present for views, but I turned it off just to demonstrate that this isn't, this doesn't affect listings by default. Now we can use a module like node view permissions to extend this a little bit. So let me go to the page for this module. Node view permissions is about the simplest module that I would actually recommend that you might use. What this does is split up the viewing permissions by content type. So this means you can have a role that can see some content types and can't see others. So if you've got a scenario where there's only a few pieces of content on your site that are private and they are all similar enough to share a content type, this is a really simple way of restricting access. You build a content type that's private and make sure that the anonymous user can't see it, but your logged in people can. So that's about the simplest possible solution, which is nice because as these things get complicated, it's risky. As we're going to the more involved ones, if you misconfigure something or do something wrong, the downside, the risk is higher, or rather the potential harm is higher than with a lot of other complicated setups, because what the potential harm is that people can see things they shouldn't be allowed to see, which can be pretty bad, or people can edit things they're not allowed to edit, which is probably worse. So you really have to understand what you're setting up in order to put any of these solutions in place, which is why something really simple like this one is a good choice if you can get away with that. So let's go up one step from that to content access. The content access module gives you all of those same permissions that we talked about for each content type and possibly for each individual node. So let me see if I have this turned on still on my demo site. Yes, okay. So this is turned on now. So as the administrator, if I go in to one of these content types, there is a new tab that's added called Access Control. And if I click on that, I get view any, view own, edit any, edit own, delete any, and delete own permissions, just like you'd see on the permissions page for this kind of content for each role. Also, there is a checkbox you can turn on to say that you want those to be settable for every individual node, not just for the content type as a whole. And if you do that, then when you go to one of these pieces of content and click access control, now you get this access control tab for the piece of content that gives you all of those same choices. Now in this example, I have gone ahead and also enabled another module, which is, I would expect it to be linked here, but it is not. It is called ACL, Access Control List, which is a module that doesn't expose any UI, but adds more backend hooks. And if this is turned on, then we get more choices at the bottom. We get the ability to grant view, update, and delete access for individual users on this piece of content. So really, any possible access scenario for editing or viewing is covered by this combination. The downside is that this is pretty ugly, and this is with only 3 roles. On a lot of Drupal sites, you can easily have 7 or 8 roles, which means that all of these get pretty long. And then you have individual users you might have added to individual pieces of content. It can just get a little unwieldy. So the takeaway on this one is it's a great solution if you have potentially some pretty complicated access permission combinations that you need to enable, but you have a limited and skilled set of administrators who are going to be managing all of that stuff. It's not great if you have less sophisticated users that need to actually do the management, because this isn't always self-explanatory. Okay, so then we can take a step to the side to a module that is going to look at just the editing part and not the viewing part. So there is a whole suite of modules called Workbench, and one of the modules in that suite is called Workbench Access. Workbench Access lets you define what they call editorial sections. It's a hierarchy, kind of like a taxonomy. And within each section, you can have content assigned to that section, and you can have editors for that section. And editors can't create content or edit content in a section that doesn't belong to them. So this works really great if the site is public. You don't need to control access, viewing access, but you've got an editorial staff that has their own defined portions of the site. It's best if this structure also mirrors the menu structure of the site, even though that's not required. That's definitely the easiest mapping of Workbench Access. It's also really great. It plays really well with moderation. So if, I mean, you can tell from the examples and just the wording that this is, they're thinking about this as a publication with departments in charge of different sections. So that's a good option for that scenario. And then the most sophisticated one that I want to I want to talk about briefly is called Group. Group is the Drupal 8 equivalent of what used to be called organic groups. I was hoping to have RJ on, who's thinking of coming, because I know that they are using this on the Davenport sites to manage a lot of sophisticated relationships between users and content. This is like the Workbench module in that you create what in this case are called groups instead of sections that can be associated with users and can be associated with content. But it is quite a bit more complex because those groups are themselves full-fledged entities with relationships to those things. The UI is a lot, but you can actually do things like have different access levels within a group. So a person could be the editor of one section of a site and an administrator on a second section and just a user on a third section. That kind of scenario is possible with Group. They give some example uses, which I think are very accurate. If you've got things, something where the groups with Workbench moderation, you'd probably set up the sections once and then run with it. Group is going to be more flexible in terms of the groups maybe appearing and disappearing as you go. So they give the example of classes on a school website, for example. Sub-communities within a membership organization. So where like groups.drupal.org is an example of how this might work. That was an old organic groups site that is moving this direction. And so in this case, the group itself might be created on the fly based on people's interests. So this is kind of the big hammer if you need some pretty sophisticated access controls. So we talked a little bit about the other modules that that are out there and how to find them. I'd like to talk just a little bit about how you might evaluate whether they are worth using. There's a hazard with a lot of the modules out there. A lot of them define this hook entity access. So you'll see something called module name underscore node underscore access, for example. And what the module will do is, well, let me see if I can find an example of this. Yeah. Okay, so as I was going through possible modules, I saw view access per node. This looked nice. Very simple access control module so that you could view content on a per node basis. So that sounded nice. And if we look at the code of this one, and we look at the module file itself, we can see what it does. Okay, so it has a help hook. It's going to alter some forms, fine. It has hook node access. And what it's doing is it's saying, oh, I only care about viewing things. And it returns access results accordingly. And that's the end of this module. Now it's just some supporting stuff, but this is the only hook that it defines. So what that means is that that module is going to have exactly the same problem I illustrated here with published. That hook is only called when you actually are on an individual node page. It doesn't affect listings in any way. And that is typically a pretty big problem because you don't want to advertise the existence of things that people don't have access to usually. So as a general rule, avoid modules that handle access just this way. Instead, we want to look at, I think there's a topic here for this. Node access rights, okay. Instead, you want to find modules that define both hook node grants and hook node access records, or I guess hook entity type access records, hook node access records. And again, I said I wouldn't go into detail on how to build these things, but a properly constructed node access module is going to define hook node grants to tell Drupal what a user can do, and it's going to define hook node access records in order to tell Drupal what permissions a piece of content has, and those two have to be combined in database queries to make listings work correctly. So how to write those is a full topic in itself, so I won't go into any more detail on that, but that's just something to look out for if you are going to investigate any other options. So in summary, in order to pick a good solution, what you want to do in general is pick the simplest access control solution that fits your needs, because the more complicated it is, the more possibilities that something might go wrong. And in many cases, either the out-of-the-box solution or something like content access will be enough, or you might even write your own if you have a special case that you want to build a nicer UI for than some of these sophisticated ones can do. So that brings me to the end of what I had prepared to say. I have summarized all of this in an article that I will post on the topic page for today on the group, that goes through, again, what you can do with the out-of-the-box Drupal functionality, goes through the modules that I talked about today with links to those on Drupal.org for installation, and a little bit about, very briefly, what I was talking about with respect to the hooks you should expect to have implemented in order for a module to do the correct job. So I think that covers it. So any questions or?
Where's the topic page?
Yeah, on the meetup page for today.
Is it under the meeting comments, or?
Yeah, I'll put it in the meeting comments. Yep, for today I'll put a link to this.
Of today's event?
Yep.
Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
That's what I'm referring to. Yes. Yep. Today's event. I'll put this recording of today as well as this article link.
Okay.
If there's a better way of doing that, I'm not an expert at Meetup, so there might be a better way of doing that for posterity, but that's my plan for now.
Uh-huh.
Um, any
Okay.
any personal experiences with access control, horror stories, or things that have worked well in the past? I know you've done some, Mike. You've done some builds involving some content access. Have you typically been using one of these modules or rolling your own?
Um, as time goes by, the more I default to writing my own. Uh, I think the thing that you mentioned that couldn't ring any more true is stay as simple as possible. Um, Not necessarily just because um, it's more difficult to administer, but for me, it's more difficult to debug. Like for probably more than just about anything else, access control is just a really hard thing to debug because you have to switch who you're pretending to be in order to really test different things or use different users or masquerade whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of other fallout because once you do that, you might lose like some of your admin access. If you're testing somebody with only view access,
Yeah,
well, now all of a sudden you've lost your ability to even look at debug messages or stuff
right.
like that. So it's just complicated. So if there is a way, and typically the situations that I've come across, and really for most of Drupal 8, when I do come across it, it's mostly, hey, we have these set of pages that we don't want anybody to see, and um, and then going with the access grants type stuff,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is not the easiest thing to understand, but
Yeah,
certainly the way to go.
yeah, and those when you have those grants, when you have a module that's doing that kind of thing, like this example site is using the that content access module. Um, it will save all of the access information about nodes to a special table called node access in the database. And it is possible if you install one of these things after you already have content, or if you make certain configuration changes, it is possible for that it could get out of sync with the actual um, the actual content itself. And on the status page of the site, there is a link for rebuilding the that whole permissions table. Um, that is good to know that it exists. You really don't want to use it if you don't have to, because on a big site, what that means is it's going to revoke access to everything and then churn through and put things back. So you're going to have a period of outage. Basically, this site only has 5 nodes on it, so rebuilding the permissions should be pretty darn quick. It has to look through everything. Yep, so that's done. But again, if you had a lot of content, that's not fun. So um, just another thing to be aware of. So I think there was an example last time of, there were a couple examples. One was that Jack was asking about was there's a site where there was going to be a member directory, which was going to be family information. So possibly more than one user per family that can edit that family's information. And so the out of the box, so if each family had one user, you could do that with the out of the box abilities. You would just make people able to edit their own content, and you would make people the author of their own family information. but with more than one user per family, what you'd have to do, probably the reason I have this installed right now is I think this is the easiest solution for them. If you had content access and ACL turn on, then for a given piece of content, an administrator could go in and grant update access, which is the same thing as editing access, for the specific users. It would have to do it manually here, but it would have the upside of not having to write any code. And that should allow any of those users to edit that piece of content. So that was going to be my recommendation for a no code solution to that problem. So I think that brings us to the end. If there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up here, and possibly next time, one of the things held over here is I might actually go through the steps involved in writing your own content access module if you have a specific use case that isn't covered by these. It's actually not too bad once you understand what's happening, but it can be a little tricky to get through that hurdle. So that's a topic for the future. Other topics are always welcome to chime in on the meetup page with suggestions for topics, or especially for volunteering to speak about them. So that will bring us to the end of the recording.